All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We are diving back into the Forged Act today. We've been spending quite a bit of time on this really comprehensive piece of legislation.
It really is, yeah. It's quite the undertaking.
And today I think we're tackling something pretty interesting. We're going to be talking about Section 101. And I think this is the part of the act that focuses on streamlining the whole defense acquisition process.
It does, yeah. It's quite the it's interesting because it essentially repeals a significant number of existing laws.
Really? Like wiping them off the
Wiping them off the books, that's right.
Wow, that's a pretty big change.
It's a big change, yeah. And it really speaks to, I think, the efforts to try and simplify what a lot of people see as an overly complicated system.
Yeah, for sure. So, before we even get into the specifics, just to give our listeners a little bit of context, we're not here to argue whether this is the right or wrong approach.
Right.
We're really just here to break down what Section 101 actually does. What are the possible implications, especially for folks who are involved in the defense sector in some way.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the potential impacts, right? Whether you're directly involved or just interested in how this all works.
Right, exactly. So let's dive in. When you talk about repealing existing laws, where does that even start? What are we looking at here?
Well, the heart of it all is in Section 101A. And that's where you find a long, detailed list of specific legal provisions that are basically being shown the door. It's not just, vague references. It really gets down to the nitty-gritty, specific sections within Title 10 of the U.S. Code.
Title 10, that's the big one for the military, right?
Exactly. That's the foundation. But it also goes beyond Title 10. It tackles individual sections from all sorts of National Defense Authorization Acts spanning, many years, and even dives into parts of other public laws that touch on this stuff.
Wow.
It's comprehensive, to say the least.
Okay, so to help me wrap my head around this, can we maybe get into some examples? Like what kind of stuff from Title 10 got the axe?
Sure. Let's take, for instance, one of the first things you see on the list, Section 101, A1. This repeals Section 3067 of Title 10. Now, I won't bore you with the legal jargon.
Please no.
But in a nutshell, this particular section had to do with regulations for the Army. And, the Army's a massive organization, procurement, personnel, you name it. And this section was part of that regulatory framework. And they just said, nope, we're done with that.
So that was it, like a whole section of rules governing some aspect of how the Army operates. Just gone.
Gone. And you see similar things with Sections 3070 and 3072, both also repealed. Again, very specific elements related to the Army's inner workings. Each removal, each one of these, signals a choice, right? Either they're updating these regulations somehow somewhere else, or they're saying, you know what, we don't need this anymore.
So it's about clearing out the clutter, basically. And they didn't just stop at individual sections within Title 10. They went for entire chapters. That's a big deal, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a much bigger change. Think about Section 101A7. This one repeals the entire Chapter 205 of Title 10. This whole chapter was all about managing certain defense supplies. Now imagine, you know how huge and varied the stuff the DoD has to deal with is? Just think about that inventory.
All right, it's massive.
Right, and they repealed a whole chapter dedicated to how they manage it. It's a fundamental shift, really, in their approach. And it doesn't start there. Chapter 258, dealing with military claims, gone. Chapter 273, covering canteens and military exchanges, that's out too. And then there's Chapter 345 about miscellaneous procurement provisions, also completely repealed. We're talking about massive chunks of law, stuff that govern big parts of how the military operates. And they just decided to say, we're moving on.
So it seems like a pretty clear message that they're really serious about streamlining this whole process.
Yeah. It seems like they felt these chapters were either, outdated, inefficient, maybe even duplicated somewhere else in newer regulations. They basically looked at the whole thing and said, let's simplify.
It's pretty amazing to see this kind of sweeping change in such a traditionally bureaucratic system. And it wasn't just about getting rid of all the old stuff, right? I saw that some of the repealed sections were actually from, fairly recent National Defense Authorization Acts.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really important point to highlight. The Section 101, it really casts a wide net. It goes back, way back, but it also looks at much more recent attempts to, regulate defense acquisition. For example, you've got the repeal of Section 874 and Section 913 from the NDAA for fiscal year 2018.
Okay, so pretty recent.
Yeah. And then there's Section 810 of the NDAA for fiscal year 2016. And if you go back even further, there's Section 843 of the NDAA for fiscal year 2013. And it's interesting, they're also repealing some things from more recent NDAAs, like Section 153 from the NDA for fiscal year 2024. So it's not just about, oh, this is old, let's get rid of it. They're looking at stuff they tried in the past decade or so and deciding, you know what, this isn't working the way we hoped. It's like a constant process of reevaluation, a commitment to keeping things, up to date and relevant.
So they're willing to admit when something isn't working. That's refreshing. And not just whole sections, right? I seem to remember seeing specific subsections being repealed, like they were getting really specific with it.
Exactly. They were definitely taking a scalpel to certain sections. A good example of that would be Section 101, A20. It specifically repeals subsections A through C of Section 804 of the Duncan Hunter National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2009. That level of detail, that precision, it tells you they weren't just throwing everything out. They were going through and saying, okay, this part of this larger section is problematic or isn't relevant anymore, but maybe the rest of it can stay. It shows a much more nuanced approach, I think, to this whole streamlining effort.
So it was definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. It was very tailored. And to add another layer of complexity here, we're not just talking Title 10 and the NDAAs, right? You mentioned other public laws getting caught up in this.
Absolutely. It goes beyond the core defense laws. For
Right.
example, Section 101A 52 repeals Section 797 of the Department of Defense Appropriation Act 1983. That shows they were also looking at laws that dealt with how money gets allocated to the DoD.
So not just the rules, but also the funding mechanisms.
Right. And because that section was part of an Appropriations Act, it likely set specific conditions on how money could be used for procurement. Getting rid of it suggests they want more flexibility in how the DoD manages its acquisition budget. And here's another interesting one. Section 101A66 repeals Section 13,004 of the CARES Act.
The CARES Act. Wow.
I know, right? So even emergency legislation had stuff related to defense acquisition that they now think is unnecessary. It really highlights how widespread these regulations are.
It's pretty amazing to think about. So we've got this incredibly broad range of repeals going on, from the core legal code in Title 10 to specific parts of all these defense authorization bills, appropriations acts, even emergency legislation. It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Now, Section 101 also mentions something called clerical amendments in subsection B. What are those all about?
Well, the clerical amendments are essentially the cleanup crew, if you will. They come after all the big changes in subsection A. Think of it like, you remove a bunch of chapters from a book, right?
Right.
You got to update the table of contents. That's what this is. These amendments go through the tables of sections at the beginning of all the chapters and subchapters in Title 10 and take out any reference to the stuff that got repealed.
So it's like making sure the legal text is all neat and tidy after all the changes. Can you give us some specific examples of how this works?
Sure. For instance, Section 2228 of Title 10 was repealed. That one dealt with, a specific piece of the defense acquisition system. Well, Chapter 131 of Title 10 covers the whole defense acquisition system. So they had to update the table of sections at the beginning of Chapter 131 to remove the reference to 2228, which doesn't exist anymore. And you see this in other chapters, too, like Chapter 203, which is all about the Army, Chapter 207, which is about the Air Force, even specific subchapters within Chapter 209, which deals with land forces.
So it's not just about changing the laws themselves. It's about making sure all the references and cross-references are updated to reflect those changes.
Exactly. It's all about accuracy and clarity, because imagine, without these updates, the official index would still be pointing to laws that don't exist anymore. It'd be a real mess.
It would be chaos. So we've talked about all the laws being repealed. It's a lot, but we kind of get the what now. What about the why? The title of Section 101 is pretty clear. It's all about streamlining the defense acquisition process. Is that really the main goal here, the reason for all these changes?
Yes, that's really the heart of it. It's all about making things more efficient. The idea is that by getting rid of all these requirements that are maybe outdated, redundant, or just overly burdensome, the whole process of acquiring, the stuff the DoD needs will become faster, more agile, less bureaucratic.
Okay, that makes sense. If you keep adding laws and amendments over time, it just gets more and more complicated.
Exactly. It's like anything else, right? If you don't clean out the closet every once in a while, it just becomes a mess. And it's harder to find what you need.
So in this case, Congress is basically saying, let's declutter the legal framework for defense acquisition and see if that helps things run a little smoother.
Exactly. They're trying to create a clearer path for the DoD to get what it needs.
So for our listeners who are trying to understand the impact of all this, where should they even start? I mean, it's a lot of information, over 280 specific laws being repealed. How do you even wrap your head around that?
It's true. It can seem pretty overwhelming. For those of you listening who work with the DoD or alongside it, I think the best place to start is to figure out which of these repealed sections were actually relevant to your work. Think about it. Were there any specific provisions that you had to consult or comply with regularly? If so, and those are gone now, that'll give you a good idea of how your day-to-day might change.
So it's about focusing on the stuff that directly affects you. And what about for those of us who, are interested in how this whole system works, but maybe don't have a direct connection to it? What's the big takeaway for us?
Well, I think for the general listener, the sheer number of repeals is a big deal. It tells you that Congress is making a serious effort to simplify the laws that govern defense acquisition. It shows that they've identified a bunch of areas that they think are either unnecessary or actually getting in the way of efficiency.
Yeah.
And it gives you a sense of just how complex this whole system had become.
That's like a historical record almost, isn't it?
Yeah, in a way. And it shows this current push for reform. They're not just tinkering around the edges. They're really trying to shake things up.
And make things better, hopefully.
Ah.
So to wrap things up, we've spent this deep dive focused on Section 101 of the Forged Act. And we've seen how it really goes after streamlining defense acquisition by repealing like a ton of existing laws. We're talking over 280 specific provisions, everything from individual sections within Title 10 to whole chapters. And we even saw how it affects National Defense Authorization Acts and other public laws.
And we've seen how the main goal is to create a more efficient process for everyone involved. For those of you in the thick of it, figure out which of these changes affect you directly. And for everyone else, just keep in mind, this is a major effort to simplify a really complex system.
All right, so here's something to think about as we sign off. Look back at all those laws that got repealed, all those regulations that built up over time. What does that tell us about how complex systems, naturally tend to become? And then think about the specific sections that were removed. What clues might that give us about where defense acquisition is headed in the future? Could we see, some new efficiencies? Are there maybe some unintended consequences we haven't thought of yet? Lots to ponder. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for having me.